Ever since 2020 and the lockdowns, we've all been looking for good ways to play our favorite tabletop RPGs online. Even now that those times are a while past, arranging time to meet your friends in person for a session can be difficult, and the resources and miniatures and terrain that you may want to visually enhance the experience require a lot of dedication, both in time and money. So many of us turn to services like Roll20, and such services have their place. They have a lot of features that make the running of your campaigns easier and pre-made adventures more accessible. Yet when I got into the hobby of running tabletop RPGs, the 2D environment and relative lack of interactivity didn't really appeal to myself nor to my friend group. And that is when we began to discover that there are better options for running your tabletop RPG campaigns online. So I'm not going to string you along any further, and I'll go ahead and give you the following disclaimers about our method. With it, you'll get probably the best three-dimensional interactive experience possible online. However, it is not free and requires at least one person, preferably the GM, to have a half-decent computer. There are two halves to our method, and this brings us to the first. Part 1. Tabletop Simulator. Tabletop Simulator, if you didn't know, is one of the best games you can own on PC. It does exactly what it says on the tin. It simulates tabletop games from Monopoly to D&D to Warhammer and pretty much everything in between. Even if you have no plans of even playing tabletop RPGs, in which case why are you watching this video, it's still worth having just because there are so many good games to play with your friends. I would recommend Uno Infinity.
Bro, you didn't have another red or a one?
Oh no. Oh my. Oh no. I'm sorry, James.
No!
For the purpose of tabletop RPGs, pretty much all of them will have a pre-made setup someone has already gotten done for you. Just go to the Steam Workshop, type in your system of choice's name, and most of the time you'll find a table ready-made with character sheets, rules references, and a DM screen and tools at the ready. Tabletop Simulator will not run the game for you, nor do many calculations by itself, but it makes up for that with sheer interactivity and versatility. You can physically keep counts of your coins, take notes, draw, throw dice around, and all sorts of other things. It is by far the closest approximation of actually sitting around the table with your friends that you can get online. It is also limitlessly modular. You can import your own character models from Hero Forge, an excellent if sort of expensive website for making characters. However, I'm a college student and sometimes I don't want to pay anything when I just need some random grunts for my players to fight. That's when we pull out one of two methods: the completely free screenshot or snipping tool method, or the cheap but not free portrait method, in which you require the pro version of Hero Forge but can then take backgroundless pictures of your models, which will be a little nicer than doing this and cutting out the backgrounds manually. Either way, get two pictures, front and back, and then import them into Tabletop, and you have as many models as you want on a budget. From that point, you can import any of the hundreds of 2D battle maps your table might already have made for you, or you can import your own via uploading them to the Steam cloud. A little bit of computer literacy is required to get everything out of this process, but if you're willing to learn, you can essentially solve every problem you might have, and without it taking too much of your time away either. Have a bunch of rules you want your players to easily reference, but the table you found didn't have any? Take screenshots of a legally owned PDF of your system's rules, or good photos of a physical rulebook, upload them, and then make them into a single object you can switch states on, as is displayed here. Otherwise, you can fit everything you can possibly want in here. World maps? Check. Region maps? Check. A final resting place for fallen characters? We've got that, and a hall for heroes of times past as well. I've run over half a dozen campaigns using nothing but Tabletop Simulator, and honestly, it does a pretty good job. Even the little things like the physicalization of money add so much. It makes things feel just that little bit more real. And there's nothing like you and your friends poring over the region map, deciding where to go next, which cave to explore or dungeon to clear. It really gives you the feeling of being at a table. You can even import your own music, change the background image you're surrounded by, and otherwise make it feel like a place ripe for adventure. However, there's one thing that Tabletop Simulator has always struggled with, and that is, ironically, the maps. You see, personally, while I have a lot of respect for 2D battle maps, I mean, they are entirely the default, and entire companies subsist off of selling designs for them, at the end of the day, there's only so much you can do with 2 dimensions. Fighting on multiple floors or levels is difficult, and everything is reduced to hexes or squares that, while perfectly functional, aren't always immersive. Tabletop Simulator does have some 3D maps, but they aren't particularly common. They can be buggy with weird hitboxes, and they're not in any way modular. If there are details you don't want, you can delete them, but never really replace them with anything, at least not easily. And the process of actually putting them together yourself is, as far as I'm concerned, technological witchcraft that even my terminally on a computer self doesn't have the time, patience, or skill for. So where did we go to solve this lack of the third dimension? That brings us to part 2, Talespire. Tired of the only 2D maps, and at the end of a year-long hiatus of pretty much no tabletop RPGs, my group wanted some things done differently. The first part of that was running Cyberpunk Red, our first time stepping outside of Dungeons & Dragons, as we'd only done 3.5 and 5e at the time. And the second was using a little program called Talespire. Talespire is super underrated. I almost never hear about it, which is really strange, because for us it's been a completely revolutionary piece of software. Talespire essentially is a map maker for 3D tabletop RPG maps, either of a fantasy, steampunk, or cyberpunk kind of bend. You can import your character models just like you would on Tabletop Simulator, roll dice, and most importantly, have the third dimension. I cannot possibly overstate how big of a deal that is for battle maps. You don't notice it quite as much when you don't have it and have never had it, but when you have, you will never be able to live without them. When you boot up Talespire for the first time, you might mess around for a while, build a little house or something, read the tutorials, and then think, now what? I can't make literally everything myself. And that's fine, because that's what I thought, and the thing is, you don't have to. There's a wonderful and easy-to-use website called Tales Tavern, which I will link in the description, which contains hundreds of already made maps done by some incredibly creative and skilled people. While there are definitely more maps for fantasy settings than Cyberpunk, we still had more than enough to run a full Cyberpunk campaign without having to worry too much about repeats or a lack of maps, not to mention that, of course, I made several for myself, though I'm not particularly good at it. Either way, the potential for maps in Talespire is literally limitless. It's also pretty easy to use and has a ton of different terrains, materials, and aesthetics. The lighting options alone are commendable and can really give the perfect vibes at the right moment. It even has background ambiance and music, which is above and beyond what I might have expected. Talespire is relatively modular. You can attach and rename certain characteristics or stats that your players have, ammunition counts, money, and kinda that sort of thing. But it definitely does not have as much interactivity as Tabletop Simulator. It also does not support any system of importing rules or images, which for a simpler system like Cyberpunk Red wasn't that big of a deal, but it did require a workaround on my end. We had to take our Discord server and fill it with rules references from the game so players could refer to things there. It was definitely not perfect, but it worked alright, and we decided it was worth it for the boon of actually playing with three-dimensional maps. Talespire is also still getting updated pretty frequently. New items, models, and pieces of terrain are added every now and again, and they're all of great quality. The most useful of the recent updates was that there is now creature modding, allowing people to upload custom models, so you don't have to rely on Hero Forge exclusively, as only the full-fledged 3D models that you buy individually can be directly imported into Talespire. Either way, even despite some of the inconveniences of using Talespire and Cyberpunk Red, which I have my problems with, though that's for a later date, we had a wonderful time with the campaign. One of the other biggest things I've yet to mention is the measurement of distance. On 2D battle maps, you have to use hexes or squares as measurements of movement, and you have to have these weird rules around diagonals, or have to decide what is or isn't flanking, and all of that sort of thing. Talespire took that problem and sucker punched it into space. In Talespire, you can just measure distances. You can even change the scale and name of the distances measured to fit with your system. It's such a little thing, but just being able to draw a line and say, I move exactly there feels so much better than hopping squares like a game of Parcheesi. It's also great for interactions with ranged weapons. Terrain actually feels like it matters. You can hide behind things, under things, and it'll actually feel right. Can the shooter see where you'd be, or can he not? It's an actual question you may ask now. At the end of the day, being able to see and feel the distance in an immersive environment between your characters and the guys rushing down the hall with shotguns to kill them is a hard feeling to match. Navigating through houses, bunkers, sewers, and office buildings, which would have been slow, clumsy, and not all that impressive with 2D battle maps, all worked supremely well with Talespire. Especially in a more modern setting with the verticality required by having so many buildings around, I cannot imagine having relied on switching out 2D boards every time someone changed floors. I mean, honestly, especially for simpler systems, if you're willing to put the work into having an alternate place for your players to reference rules, Talespire alone is something you can get away with running. Though you might want something like DocHub or even Google Slides to hold character sheets. However, there is a reason that I phrase it this way. Recently, I discovered Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4e. Now, if you've been watching the channel, you know I love Warhammer Fantasy. It is my favorite fictional verse by far. When I found out it had a modern, supported tabletop RPG, I was all in. Not least because my world, especially the mechanics of my magic, were primarily inspired by the magical lores of Warhammer Fantasy. We tried making my magic system work in D&D, but it never quite fit. It's not a problem with D&D, it's just not built for the kind of magic system that I wrote. But Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay? Oh baby, it had everything. Elemental magic, mechanical complexity, depth, and lots of unique rules. Did you know it actually portrays plate armor as something other than just slightly better chainmail? Did you know that swords and axes actually act like different weapons? I was in heaven, let me tell you. The problem came when I realized Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is not a simple system like Cyberpunk Red or D&D 5e. There's nothing wrong with simple systems, and that's best emphasized by what happened next, but Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay was too complex to just have a rules reference in the Discord server for. Its name is also too long, so I'm just going to call it WFRP from now on. You see, in WFRP, not only do you use a D100 percentile system, which was already different, but you measure levels of success when it comes to actually making rolls. Say I have a 50 to my climb skill. I want to roll under that to pass. Say I get a 32, that's 2 tens places, 2 levels of success, I pass. If I'd rolled a 92, that'd be 4 levels of failure and I'd fall. It's a good system and it makes plenty of sense once you're actually used to it, but it is just not as intuitive as roll a d20 and a higher number is better. And that's just the start. So I realized that my players, and I myself, were regularly forgetting important things. Certain abilities lay unused, experience unspent, or players unsure of where or how to use it, all because actually getting to the rules to refer to them was inconvenient because we had them put in the Discord. We couldn't have anything in Talespire, so our rules were in one place, our character sheets were in another. It just wasn't a great system. One of our players wasn't even able to run Talespire consistently, so the poor guy just had to sit on his phone and listen to things and watch someone stream of it. That's when I had the biggest brain moment in the history of big brain moments. Part 3, just do both, dummy. Whoa, so you're telling me if I take this one thing that's good at representing the feel of a tabletop game, has plenty of allowances for displaying rules and character sheets, but doesn't have many 3D maps, then take the thing that does have 3D maps and does those other things badly, and then use both at the same time, I get a better result? Say it ain't so. Yeah, so now we just use both. I've got a monstrous PC, as does my editor and one of my players, so we just keep both games up at the same time, swapping from one to another as needed via alt-tabbing. Even 2 of my other players with decent but not crazy good computers can actually have both up at the same time as well, and both games are pretty light to run. Even if you can't run both at once, if you only use Talespire for battles and Tabletop for everything else, it won't be too big a deal to just close one and swap to the other as needed. My one player who couldn't run Talespire could run Tabletop, and so he actually has something to do now. Before I address how much of an improvement for us this has been, I do need to keep it straight with you. I'll address some of the mechanics of doing this, and the first of those is that at a bare minimum to do this, the GM should be able to keep both games up at once, simply because you might need to refer to the rules that you're keeping in Tabletop Simulator while fighting a battle in Talespire. This doesn't require that strong of a computer, but it is worth noting that not every PC can do this. If at least the GM can do this, then everyone else can either watch a stream of the Talespire battle or switch individually over to it as needed, so the PC requirements on everybody else are not as high. Another thing to address is cost. I could say
Well, this is all obviously cheaper than playing with physical minis and terrain in person.
But that's kind of a cop-out, especially if you're coming from the perspective of not having a PC that can do this, at which point the price differential goes anywhere from non-existent to negative. And I'm not going to tell you to buy a PC just to do this unless you really want to. However, if you do have the hardware, this will at minimum run you $20 USD per person for each copy of Tabletop Simulator. A full copy of Talespire costs $25, but you only need one of those for the Game Master. Otherwise, Talespire has a seats system in which the GM can buy seats for their campaign priced at $15 per head, or a deal of $50 for 4, which will allow up to however many seats they buy players to join their campaign by downloading the guest edition of the game. It's nice because these can be swapped out. It's only essentially an amount of slots that get filled, but it is an extra price you have to pay. However, you can get away with nobody else having any version of Talespire at all if the GM is willing to stream the game. It will definitely be more clumsy to run, and they won't be able to move their characters around themselves, but if you don't want to spend the extra money, it will function. Whether or not any of this is worth it is entirely up to you. It has been worth it for us, but it is ultimately your decision to make. For our group, it's been great. Now we can still enjoy the 3D maps of Talespire while also having Tabletop as a consolidated place to refer to things. All our character sheets are there, rules references are there, and we can have that interactive experience. Yet when it comes time to battle, we've also got Talespire and we can play on a 3D map. It took a tiny bit of getting used to, but at this point I wouldn't do anything else. We've got the best of both worlds. Especially when considering the increased complexity of running a game like WFRP, it has made it all a great deal more manageable. All I had to do was add rules references to the board, and now they are at the player's fingertips in a place they'll actually be looking. Sure, it's great putting everything in a Discord channel, but nobody wants to scroll through that. Put it somewhere nice and convenient, right next to their character sheet even, you'll find you're having to answer repeat questions quite a lot less. However, with all things in mind, we can move on to part 4. What works for you? Ultimately now, it comes down to what you want to do. If you have the resources, time, and schedule to play in person, by all means do that. But if you're going to do it online, and I mean, you're watching this video so you probably will, let's consider our options. I'm going to rank these programs, including Roll20, from my least to most preferred in terms of running them solo. I could include combining them as an option, but then you already know I'd put just use Talespire and Tabletop at number 1, and I'm not going to pretend that'd be a surprise. I might still gush about it a little more at the end though, but we'll see. So, in last is actually Talespire when run by itself. It does what it does really well. They're 3D maps, they're modular, high in number, and built for use in tabletop RPGs. However, the complete lack of player interfacing other than rolling dice and moving models around, alongside no effective rules integration, makes running campaigns where any rules unfamiliarity at all is going to happen quite a headache. It wasn't so bad with Cyberpunk Red, but even then there were moments of me awkwardly scrolling through the Discord rules references failing to find the things I was looking for. This isn't a fault in Talespire. It isn't really trying to be in everything in one. It is doing one thing, has basic integration for certain other things, and subsists entirely off of being 3D and not requiring hex or square movement. These are big things and it can persist just fine off of them, but I really do think it requires Tabletop Simulator to bring it to its full potential. Next, when run on its own, is Roll20 and its equivalents. I cannot in good faith say that much as I haven't played a full campaign with either of these, but I know they have good integrations of 2D battle maps and contain tons of content and stuff that may be especially useful to first-time players, like assisted creation of character sheets and the like. I'm sure it's perfectly functional, it just isn't what I or my players were feeling, and if you're still watching at this point, I imagine you feel the same. Even if you don't feel the same, I appreciate you checking out an alternate perspective. Finally, I'd say Tabletop Simulator is the best to run by itself. While the 3D maps are rare and kind of annoying to use, there are some if you must have them, and if you don't need them and don't mind 2D, this has them in spades alongside all the other benefits I've been talking about. It's hard to prove and harder to explain, but Tabletop just feels good to play. Maybe it's flicking your friends' models around or drawing a penis on their character sheet or having a banana for scale, but this game just has a personality, or more so, it brings out the personalities of your players, which is one of the best things that you can do. Then of course I still recommend doing both Tabletop and Talespire if you can, but if you can't, Tabletop is accessible, not too expensive, and it'll run on just about anything. Anyway, I hope this has been helpful to you. If this has given you an idea on how to run your next campaign, I'm glad for it. I really am. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed, please consider liking and subscribing. If you really enjoyed or want more of my tomfoolery, chicanery, and otherwise, we have a Discord and a Patreon, which will be linked in the description. Anyway, good luck in your companions, and remember, if you use physical coins in Tabletop Simulator, make sure nobody's borrowing their friend's money.